morning, good evening, good night, wherever you are, you're watching this from. We appreciate you dialing in and watching another video. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, or even prayer requests, just go ahead and put them in the comments below the video. You can reach us on Facebook over at Webb Baptist Church. You can also go to our website, Webb Baptist Church, or webbaptist.com. And leave a message if you have any concerns or prayer requests. We'd be glad to respond to those. As always, if you can't make it to here at Webb Baptist, get yourself involved in a Bible-based church wherever you are. And we appreciate you dialing in and watching the videos. It means a lot to us. So today's topics, we're talking about the Essenes. Okay, the Essenes were one of three groups that kind of rose out of the time in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. We've already covered the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and today we're going to be looking at the Essenes. And there's not a lot of information in regards to the Essenes. We had some information on the Pharisees based on their interactions with Jesus and in the Gospels, and also that people like Josephus and other historians were pretty much along the lines of those beliefs. And we had less information on the Sadducees, as I explained in the last video, and we have less information still on the Essenes. So anyway, so we're going to get into that and just wrap things up. So now the Essenes, for the most part, possibly means doers or makers of the Torah. Okay, so the Torah, of course, is the first 5 books of Moses, and they were a Jewish sect that came to be around the Second Temple period, and we've talked about that in the other 2 videos as well, between 516 BC to 70 AD with the destruction of the Second Temple. Most scholars believe, and I'm looking at my notes here, they originated from several priests who descended from Zadok being the temple's first high priest. They left the temple because they believed they were the legitimate priests, and I'll get into that story here in just a second. Of the 3 sects in Jesus' time, the Pharisees, Sadducees, and the Essenes, they are the only ones not directly found in Scripture. And you may be saying, well, if they're not in Scripture, why are we talking about them? Well, like I said, there's 3 that arose, and we've talked about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. I feel that we need to cover them to make it all complete of what we're talking about, because we're going through the Gospel of Mark, and these videos kind of give us some background, some extra information around this whole situation that's going on with Jesus' ministry and with the disciples. So while they're not found in Scripture, you'll see where they have an impact on the church overall here in a little bit. Now, they were highly favored by King Herod. Again, we'll get into that in just a second. Now, as we said, they come around, they arose around the Second Temple period. Okay, now what was going on during the Second Temple period? Well, if you recall, at the end of the Old Testament, the nations were judged, and God's children were carried off in bondage. Okay. And they were under prison. They were under lock and key. They were dragged away. They lost their land. And then they were brought back. The Persian king conquered Babylon, because remember, the Assyrians conquered Israel. And then Babylon conquered Assyria. And then Babylon conquered Judah. So there we go. So now we got the Persians who conquered the Babylons. And when they did that, King Cyrus told the Jewish people, yeah, you can go back home. That's no big deal. Go back home, do your worship, do your thing, but you cannot have a king. Okay, so like we explained in the last 2 videos, all that, they had no power or no control, no one in charge, so the priests, for the most part, took control. And of course, the aristocracy, the wealthy, stepped into that power void, and they took control, and they took charge of the people in general. So, and then under the Seleucids, King Antiochus IV come in, sacked the temple, and pretty much tried to, told the Jews, look, you're going to have to start doing Gentile custom, Greek customs. You can't be doing your own thing. We're not going to allow that. And of course, within 2 years, the Jewish people revolted against the Seleucids. And in that revolt, you have these three castes that emerged out of this power vacuum, so to speak. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. And we covered the first two, so this one's different. So this one's going to be about them. Now, if we look at the Essene movement just as it is, okay? So we see where the Jews won back. They revolted against the Seleucids and won back the temple, the Maccabean revolt. Now, the Essene movement originated from a group with the advent or the rise of Jonathan Apphus. Okay, Jonathan Apphus was a leader of the Jews from 161 to 143 BC. Okay, his family was part of the rebellion of the Maccabees against King Antiochus IV. Now, Jonathan received, now you got to keep in mind, they revolted, so there's a lot of chaos, power vacuum, power shifting in this area of the world at this time, okay? So Jonathan Apphus was pretty much in control of the area, and they were fighting against the Seleucids, and they were plotting one person against the other and that kind of stuff. So by the time Jonathan comes into power, Alexander Wallace of the Seleucid appointed king at that time. He's trying to shore up his power base as well. So he's trying to broker a deal, and he tells Apphus, if you, I'll give you priesthood if you support me. Okay, so of course Jonathan Apphus said, okay, yeah, we'll do that. So he got to be appointed high priest by a Seleucid appointed king. So it's kind of weird how that happened, but it was all strategic and it's all about power. Okay, so that's what happened there. So due to this appointment, Jonathan Apphus replaced the high priest at that time. Okay, now we don't know who the high priest was at that time, and we're going on the teaching of the Essenes based on the Dead Sea Scrolls, which we'll get into in a little bit. But that teacher was called the teacher of righteousness. Okay, so they didn't give a name, but the Essenes didn't like the legitimate priests at that time. They didn't like that. They didn't like being someone else be appointed because they thought they were the legitimate descendants. Okay, and so they named Jonathan, and then later on his brother, the wicked priest. So when you read these scrolls in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you'll see the teacher of righteousness and the wicked priest. It really goes back to this point in time where we have an appointed high priest who really doesn't have a priestly background, and the priests who were priests to begin with. So that's where you see a diverge. That's where you see a split, so to speak, at this time. So the Essenes pull away from that scene because they see what the Gentiles doing, their beliefs. They see the trouble. They see the sin. They see the chaos of the Gentiles, of the other nations, and they're saying, we don't want no part of that. Okay? So this is where many believe the offshoot of the Essenes began. Okay. Now, power influence are with the Sadducees and the Pharisees. They're the ones that stepped forward and they started taking charge of everything, of the nation, the Jewish people, the taxes, the finances, all that stuff. Of course, all this is under Roman law, but if there's going to be a power in control, even if it is by proxy by Rome, the rich, the Sadducees and the Pharisees said, well, we can do it. We don't need someone from Rome coming in here. We don't need a Gentile running our lives. We'll do it so long as we don't make trouble for Rome. And Rome was like, okay, that's fine. Just keep the tax money coming in. So, but as far as the Essenes go, there's nothing to suggest that they had any power or influence at all. So what's the big deal? Why are they a third religious sect at this time? Well, because of their lifestyle, which we're about to get into, they were held in high regard because of their lifestyle and their beliefs, okay? And they were pretty strict with that. So they were held in high regard, and people admired what they did, even if a lot of people couldn't or didn't want to accept what they were doing, how they lived their life. So exactly who were they? Well, they're religious sect. We'll just call them that. What you have is about 4,000 men, give or take. That's approximate, based on Josephus' work. And what they did, and what they believed, that they were pretty stringent. They were pretty tough on themselves and their community. Now, if you want to be an Essene, there's a 3-year probationary period, and you have to understand to go through all of these principles before you are accepted into the order, so to speak, or to the community. They were very monastic in their lifestyle. What I mean by that is they were very secluded. They didn't have a lot to do with the outside world at all. They shunned away from Rome. They shunned away from Gentiles. They wanted nothing to do with the outside world. Okay, so they were very private. They were very, like I said, monastic, and they really didn't want anything to do with anybody else. Okay, they'll deal with Jewish people, but Jewish people, they would do with them, but at the same time, they knew that some of these Jewish people were also corrupt due to Greek customs and that kind of stuff. So the rules and the rituals, the strict observance to the Sabbath, they dedicated their lives to an ascetic life, which was no frills and very hard for a lot of people to be a part of. Now, what do I mean by that? They were celibate. That's pretty hard right there. So now there's a group that is mentioned in certain sources, but they don't know for sure if that group is part of the Essenes that we're talking about right now. That group that had another 3-year or 2-year probationary period before they got married. And if they got married, there was very strict guidelines as far as their relationship. But everything that points to this group is that they're celibate. Okay, so they're celibate. They take a voluntary poverty. They don't own anything. They abstain from worldly pleasures. So that includes alcohol. They do not own slaves or servants. They devoted to charity, but no record of what that charity would look like. So you have these men who, for the most part, didn't want anything to do with Rome, didn't want nothing to do with Gentiles. They were poor, celibate, and abstained from a lot of world pleasures, if not all world pleasures, okay? So obviously, most of the people in society would look at that and say, that's not for me. So that explains their numbers. However, people recognize their discipline, they recognize their commitment, and that's why they were held in high standard. It's like nowadays, in our society and still in a lot of parts of the world, we have monks or in monasteries, okay? And in those places, those people are probably held in high regard because you're looking at a group of people that said, I'm 100% dedicated to God. I'm 100% dedicated to my monastic life. And God, that's the focus. And we would like to tell ourselves that we would like to spend 100% of our day spending time with God, okay? So, but these people actually do it. So when we look at the Essenes, that's what we're looking at here. So some other things that we're looking at is they believed in the immortal soul, okay? Now let's talk about, if at judgment time of the world, that could come anytime. They believed in judgment could happen at any given time at that time. So they carried weapons for protection only. Well, if they didn't own anything, how did they have weapons? Well, again, they're communal weapons, which means that no one person had them. If you had a community of 40 to 60 Essenes, not that knife that whoever's carrying around, it doesn't belong to him. It belongs to the other 60 brothers that have it. So weapons were only for self-defense against criminals and strangers and that kind of stuff. So, but it's not like they had a ton of weapons and they were weapons masters or anything like that. It was forbidden for them to take any oaths or sacrificing of animals. So they didn't believe in sacrificing animals. So pretty interesting there. They studied the books of the elders. They preserved secrets and kept the names of angels in their sacred writings. So what does that all mean? Well, it means the Essenes were very literate and they were copying and reading a bunch of different scrolls. Now, as far as all the stuff that I'm mentioning, the sources are kind of varied on all that. So what does that mean? They write down the names of angels. That could be anything. I wouldn't read too much into it because, let's be honest, none of that work really survived. There's hints of that stuff through some of the stuff that we found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that's about it. But it's not anything to sit here and say this is a major discovery or a major find. So they didn't believe in money, communal ownership of all things. So that means that if you are in this community, there's no money. Everyone owns the food. Everyone has access to the water. Everybody has access to everything. Okay, the shirt on my back is not mine. My shirt can be shared with everybody in the community. So that's what that communal living looks like. They didn't own slaves because they wanted to serve each other. So if you had a community of 200 Essenes, those 200 men would help each other. They would help them with whatever needed to be done. They didn't have to have slaves. They didn't want slaves. If there's work to be done, we're going to do it. Nobody else. So that's pretty interesting. Now, they have a ritual immersion every morning of immersing themselves in water. Water was used for purification, but there was repentance first. So they believed daily of pretty much repenting of sin and being purified in the water. Okay, now purification by water was something that the Jews were doing, especially at times where purification was needed, and they think that they sinned, and that's when they needed to do it. The Essenes believed in doing it every morning, so that's pretty important there. Now, it's a severe discipline by all accounts. You're just not going to say one day, I'm going to be an Essene. It just didn't happen that way. This is one where you're pretty much forsaking everything in life, every pleasure, for the sake of studying the scriptures, studying writing, and pretty much holding yourself up away from the rest of the world. So it's pretty interesting there. Now, there's one thing that stood out for me when I did all this research, and again, I'm painting with broad strokes as I have been because I don't want to get into the details or the minutiae, so to speak, because I want you to do that for yourself. I'm just painting with broad strokes, so this can supplement what we're learning with Mark. But going through this, I found something that was pretty interesting. They regarded all men as equal. Yes, they believed all men were born equal. All men are equal. Because they realized if you take away the power, you take away the money, you take away the status, you take away slavery, everyone's the same. Everyone sleeps, everyone eats, everyone gets up in the morning, those kind of things. Everybody puts their clothes on the same way, yada, yada, yada. They believe that. Now, why is that a big deal? Well, you got to understand that during this time, we're in the ancient world, okay? And in the ancient world, slavery was something that was quite the norm, okay? And it was not something that wasn't a secret. And if you're a slave, and you just have to accept that. That's your existence. Now, in the Roman and the Greek cultures, you have more of indentured servants that you're selling yourself out to. But the bottom line is slavery was something that was just a part of life. Well, the Essenes didn't believe in slavery. They believed that everyone was born equal. Now, and I say to myself when I read that, if the Essenes were not so secluded and they didn't live in such a bubble and being so reclusive and away from the world and not having anything to do with the Romans or the Gentiles, would that idea have caught on of all men created equal? Just by reading that, I think the Essenes were a little bit ahead of their time because of that belief. They didn't believe in anything else that, like I said, they're reclusive. They don't want nothing to do with anybody else. But just think about that for a minute. If they actually did interact with Gentiles and Romans on every other issue, and they believe this, how many people would that idea have taken thought, taken hold in other areas and other communities? It's interesting, isn't it? Because we look at the fact that slavery was not really deemed evil until, a later part of our time, okay? And so it's only been, 200 years or less that slavery is outlawed? And it took that long. If you look at the span of our human history, that's pretty amazing. But here you have a group of people in the ancient world who believe this. Fascinating. The problem is that idea was pretty much wiped out with them. They didn't bother to mingle with society, so people, for the most part, didn't know about it until they were gone. So I thought that was pretty interesting that I would pass on. Now, as far as a political group, nah, they weren't a political group. Like I said, they kept to themselves, and Josephus said there were probably around 4,000 men. So it's not like they had any power, no influence. They were nothing. They did, like I said, they were reclusive. They didn't want anything to do with anybody. They tried to be self-sufficient. They dealt with charity. They gave to charity. They dealt with people. But for the most part, they didn't have any political aspirations and any political influence or sway whatsoever. So they shunned the Romans and the guard. They lived in caves and isolation. So what information we do have is very, very limited. So and now I made a referral to King Herod earlier. Okay, so if we look at Josephus in the Antiquities of the Jews, book 15, chapter 10, he starts talking about some of this. He was talking about an Essene named Menahem, conducted his life in an excellent manner, but had the foreknowledge of future events given to him by God. This man once saw King Herod when he was a child and going to school, and he saluted him as king of the Jews. When he, Herod, was so fortunate as to be advanced to the dignity of king, he sent for Menahem. So there's where you see the mention of the Essenes, and King Herod thought highly of them. And again, a lot of people respected and had high regard to the Essenes because of their lifestyle. Okay. Now I just mentioned the King Herod part because it just goes to show you that at that time people knew who they were, and they were part of, when someone even though King Herod is king by proxy to Rome, it's interesting to point out that even at that level, the Essenes were known for what they are, even if this one did have a direct impact to King Herod. Now, as far as the impact of the Essenes, some scholars believe that John the Baptist was an Essene because he lived in the desert, strict diet, and baptism of purification. Okay, I can understand along those lines that you would think that John the Baptist was that. However, I don't personally believe that because the differences to me are kind of obvious, okay? The Essenes were reclusive. John the Baptist was not. John the Baptist spoke loud, spoke with authority, and he baptized people. People lined up. I mean, there was mobs of people that wanted to listen to what he had to say. He was not a reclusive person. John the Baptist was a public figure. And even whenever the problems came down and he got arrested, he didn't shy from that, okay? He was baptizing people left and right. If he was in a scene, you probably wouldn't see or even heard of him. But God had a different plan for John. John's diet was much stricter than a Essene. Remember, he ate locusts and honey, okay? The Essenes ate a little bit more than that. It wasn't so strict as John the Baptist. And John the Baptist recognized that Jesus was the Messiah. The Essenes did not recognize Jesus as the Messiah, okay? So they just didn't. So when we try to compare the two, John the Baptist, was he an Essene? No, he wasn't. Okay, he just wasn't. If you use the recluse, isolation in the desert, the strict diet, baptism for purification, if you use those standards for everybody in the countryside, then everybody was an Essene, including the past prophets. So that just doesn't work. It doesn't fit. And like I said, the biggest thing is the Essenes did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah. So now, the Essenes disappeared from history around the first Jewish-Roman War. the Jewish nation, after Jesus' death, and this was around this Jewish war was around 66 to 74 A.D. Okay, so this is after Jesus' death, and things start boiling up and starting to the violence and the rebellion and all that starts to bubble over, and it gets to a tipping point where Rome has to come in and say, okay, we're going to wipe you guys out. We're tired of dealing with you. We gave you enough room. We let you worship the way you wanted to worship, and you just can't behave. So they said, we're going to get rid of you. So they sacked the temple, and they arrested, they killed, they squashed the rebellion, and pretty much dispersed the people. And that's pretty much when the Essenes disappeared from history. The Sadducees were the same way, if you remember from our video from last week. With the sacking and destruction of the temple, Sadducees for the most part were done. So out of the three groups here that we're talking about, the Pharisees are the only ones that really morphed into something more. The roots of rabbinic Judaism, it can be found in the Pharisees' approach to their beliefs. So now, in modern times, the Essenes got a little bit more attention because of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I'm not going to get into the details with those. I'm sure a lot of you have gotten some information on that, and I bet you most of it is sensationalism. As far as the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're not really anything, I don't want to say special, but I don't want to put any emphasis saying these things are gospel. For the most part, the Dead Sea Scrolls back up and authenticate things that are written in the Old Testament. They show some of the stuff that the Essenes believed in their procedures and policies in the manuscript scrolls. And then, of course, there's the scroll that everybody tends to know the Dead Sea Scrolls for, which is the War Scroll. And that was the battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. And that's the one that got the most attention. But the point I'm making here is the Essenes were the ones who they feel are responsible for these scrolls. And so it kind of just goes to show you that this is some of their work. And they all were reclusive. They lived in these caves. They shunned themselves from the world at large. And they documented and copied and wrote a lot of stuff. So the based on their efforts, we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, which to me kind of helps authenticate, helps back up and give credence to a lot of the stuff that's documented in the Old Testament. Now, some researchers tend to believe, and I tend to believe with them, that the Essenes would have an early influence with early Christianity. And what I mean by that is if you look at the Essenes and everything I've talked about, I've mentioned a monastic lifestyle, and I know what comes to your mind, which is monks for the most part. And that's where a lot of people believe, where the monastic, the monastery, the monks, all that stuff had its early beginnings with the Essenes. Okay, so if you look at a lot of monks, they do have those vows of poverty, the vows against possession, the vows against marriage, strong emotions, and those kind of things, vows of silence. So not all monasteries are the same. Some are more extreme than others. Some are more active in their communities than others. But for the most part, monasteries deal a lot with charity, with the community at large around those. So when we look at the early Essenes and what they left in their teachings, and there's no telling how many teachings and writings of the Essenes actually survived through the ancient world that did not make it to our modern time and our modern research. But it's safe to assume that they had a good influence on early Christian churches, early Christianity. Now, if we look at, there's another group called Mandeism, which is a Gnostic religion, a small number, and it's usually around the Jordan and the Iraq area. The Mandeism is heavily influenced by the Essenes' approach to life. They kind of secluded, purification rituals, and they follow along. And they are a direct influence by the Essenes. Even though that Mandeism is not big, it's a separate small religion, like I said, in Jordan and Iraq. But their influence can be seen there with this group. Now, and the thing that you got to look at when you look at if you look at anybody that claims to be Essenes of the modern day, need to understand something, and that is it's not the same. So if you see a church of the Essenes or the order of the Essenes or anything like that, well, it has nothing really to do with the original group. It's by name only. What you have is a group of people who took the extreme measures that the Essenes lived by and adopted it into their own practice. Most of these are cults. Most of these are religious groups that really have little to nothing to do with the Bible, and you should probably avoid them altogether because they have zero connection to the Essenes of the past. So that's where we are with that, and I think that's what we need to keep in mind. All right, so that's the Essenes, and like I said, there's not much going on there with them. Their biggest impact, of course, is the early Christian church, and with the Dead Sea Scrolls, what we have, and that helped authenticate a lot of things in the Old Testament. So, all right, I appreciate you dialing in and watching the video. Please hit the like or subscribe button, and find us on Facebook over there. Leave a comment and message. Go to our website and leave us a message over there if you like. Get in touch with us if you have any concerns, prayer requests. We'll be glad to pray over you, pray for you, and just keep you in our thoughts and everything that we do going forward. If you can't be at Webb Baptist Church, please get plugged in somewhere at a Bible-based church, and let's find out exactly what God's got in plan for you, okay? Because you're going to be such a blessing to that church as well as that church being a blessing to you. Until next time, take care and God bless.